been with PA for about 9 months maybe. Started in October last year, and before that worked as a geologist over in West Australia at the Super Pit in Kalgoorlie. So bring a lot of that spatial science into agriculture and geostatistics, and also have a background coming off a farm at Temora and Barmedman, called the Barmedman, so my family still farm there. So yeah, I've really enjoyed being back in New South Wales, and yeah, been working with farmers and trying to get the most out of their property. So our company, just a bit about us. So we're an independent data collection, data analytics and advisory business. Been around since about 2009, and we have a strong focus on practical TA. So precision crop, soil and water management is our focus, and we're aiming to be national. So basically we've got offices up in Toowoomba, Wagga, down in Ballarat and over in Geraldton. Just put this diagram up here which basically summarises our PA philosophy. So the first step is some form of data. So that may be some soil mapping or an EM survey, it may be some yield data, or it may just be an aerial photograph, but something that we can use to gain some insight. And we work with the grower and often agronomists and consultants to integrate their knowledge, and then we have a big focus on taking that through to an action. So when we set out to do... Okay, is that better? Yeah, so when we set out to do, for instance, a variable rate application, when we're considering collecting our data, we have that action in mind. So our focus is to make sure that we take that through, and then it comes back into the data stage when we evaluate the results. So that might be our yield maps, or maybe some follow-up soil sampling. So today my talk is mostly going to focus on variable rate applications. So I'm going to look at some of the ways that we can collect data, so some of the different methods that we can use to get the data that we need, and then mostly focus on the insight step of it, not so much the technical or practical action step. Yeah. So just to get us in the right frame of mind when we talk about variable rate applications, I've just put this slide in here to look at what drives variability. So there's three main forms. Basically, a big one in Australia is our natural or background variability. So a lot of this is due to our soil properties, so things like changes in texture across the paddock, which is linked to our cation exchange capacities, our buffering capacity, things like that, that would have been there initially when the land was cleared. They've always been there, and they're pretty difficult to change or influence. Also elevation, obviously that affects things like waterlogging, but also the flip-flop in a dry year, and frost and other things like disease can be affected by elevation. So understanding those sort of variabilities is the key to being able to manage to them. The second major group we have is due to past management practices, so cultural practices like tillage or stock or weed management, our crop history, so nutrient removal or addition due to different crop histories and variation in inputs, obviously. And there's a lot of interactions between those. The third type is just random, so if you had a hailstorm come over, or there's nothing that you could really do to predict that. And then, yeah, so I've just thrown this yield map in here to demonstrate. That's from last harvest, so we can see there was a waterlogging effect in some of these areas where these dams link up, but then you can also see that there's a very strong past management practice effect that actually used to be 8 separate paddocks and they're joined together now, so that's something that we might be able to manage to more effectively. So what are the benefits of understanding variability? So the first one that we should all be thinking about and striving for is our yield unlock. So basically if we can manage that underlying and in-season variability to remove or decrease any yield constraints that might be there, then hopefully we're going to get more product at the end of the season, and increase our yields, or increase, if it's in a pasture system, increase our pastures and the numbers that we're taking off it. The second reason that we might benefit from adopting a variable rate strategy is input use efficiency, so basically just decreasing our spend in inputs where they're not required. So if we've got a paddock that we determine that we have an area that's quite alkaline, it doesn't need liming in a section, why spend the money to lime it? We're just throwing away our money. So in that regard, there's a lot of benefits to be made with input use efficiency. And then also just some longer term management decisions that can come into things. So if we have a problem area, we do a bit of soil sampling and determine that maybe it's uneconomic to bring that into productive cropping, then maybe we sow that down to pasture and put sheep in there. So that can affect our sort of longer term management decisions. Also our crop selection, maybe we could find something more tolerant to whatever problem we had. So where to start with variable rate? So a good idea is to consider your key limiting constraints. If we find those out and we address those, then we're going to get the best return on investment, and then we can work our way through. A good thing to do is to consider the process you currently use to decide on your rates for each major input, even sitting down and writing them out, and thinking, are there any opportunities for variable rate? What are the decision-making processes that go into deciding, do we just do what we did last year? Do we call our agronomist? Do we go on a bit of a gut feel, or is there a process in place? And can we base our decisions on some sound scientific or agronomic principles? And is there a case for possibly varying our inputs in that regard? The last point is to keep it simple, so stick to what makes sense to you, and that often is doing one thing at a time so we can evaluate if we've had success rather than trying to get too fancy straight away. So I've just put up there 5 of the sort of main options that we work with for variable rate applications. There's obviously others, but these ones are probably the 5 main players. So I've sort of grouped them working upwards with basically how much input or how difficult it is to gauge a strategy to work towards a variable rate input. So lime and phosphorus down the bottom, we can get a quite direct evaluation of our pH and phosphorus levels by using something like a grid soil mapping technique. I've also put gypsum in there because I have done some work with mapping exchangeable cations, so basically getting an exchangeable sodium map at the same time as we do our pH mapping, but there are other strategies that we can use for variable rate gypsum. Phosphorus, once we do that initial audit through something like a grid soil mapping method, then we might look to a yield replacement strategy. And then for gypsum, variable rate seed and nitrogen, we can use a soil management zone strategy and use some strategic soil sampling to calibrate our rates within those soil management zones. Nitrogen, you can also bring in some in-season biomass imagery, so your NDVI imagery, plus maybe use some nitrogen strips. So I'll go through some of these methods and mostly focus on lime, because I think that's probably where the best bang for buck is as far as an introductory variable rate strategy, and then touch on the other ones as well. Okay, so firstly, just to explain the technique of grid soil mapping. So this is basically the core product of our company. We do quite a bit of grid soil mapping. So it's a high resolution direct soil mapping tool. You can see the map on the left has been broken up into a grid. So they're 2 hectare areas. Each of those circles represents a 2 hectare area. And within that area, we collect 8 subsamples. They're bulked together and sent to the lab for a direct soil measurement. It's a 0 to 10 centimetre soil sample, so we take the whole 0 to 10 centimetres, and that differs to more of a soil probe type method where you're just getting a reading at one depth within the soil, which may vary if you have changes in ground conditions. So we think that this is the most accurate direct method to get soil pH data. And this enables an accurate analysis of soil pH, but as the samples are going to the lab anyway, basically anything that you can measure at a lab, we can measure on the grid. Phosphorus is the other big one, and we mostly do pH and phosphorus measurements on the grid because those things do vary on a fairly high scale across the paddock, whereas other factors are not as highly variable and might lend themselves more to a management zone strategy, which I'll go through later. Yeah, as I said, we can also add other things, so cation exchange capacity, which lends itself to exchangeable sodium percentages, take that through to a gypsum map. Analysis is performed at a ASPAC accredited lab, which is APAL Ag Laboratory in Adelaide, who we work with. Oh, and also just to point out, so we've got the bike outside, so you can have a look at that when we get a bit of a break. That bike on the right there has an auger type drill in it, sampler, which is pretty effective during summer, so we can map all year round with this method. And also you can see in the cab there, GPS screen that the field technician will use to bring up their soil samples and basically know where they are in the paddock. So that's the method. So just to show you, the other sampler that we use is more of a soil probe type, and that works better when we've got a bit more soil moisture. The photo in the middle to the left there just shows that's similar to what the field technician would see. And then the process is basically he'll go throughout that 2 hectare area, take his 8 subsamples. We go on a bit of a diagonal, and that's just to mitigate the effects of any windrows or calibration issues with spreaders that might mean that you have some lanes of influence throughout the paddock. When those 8 subsamples have been collected, they go into a barcoded bag. The techie has a tablet and a barcode scanner on the bike, so everything's all kept in order, scanned into the box, posted to the lab, and then the analysis is completed. So generally about 2 weeks we aim for from when we do the mapping to getting the results and having an application for you. So I've got a bit of a local example for you. So thank you very much to Peter Stuckey, who has kindly enabled us to present the results of some soil mapping that we did earlier this month at his property. So this is a couple of paddocks that are about 35 kilometres north of Condo. They've been under current management for a couple of years, I believe. Last year was the first crop, which was barley crop, which did pretty well. The soil types sort of red, sandy to medium clays. The paddocks are reasonably flat, the southern one, and then a bit of a rise on the western side of that northern paddock, where there's a bit of a sandy sedimentary ridge. running north-south there that you can see in the photo. It's never been limed, and it's had a fairly traditional rotation of a few years of wheat and then reverting to native pastures. So does anyone want to take a guess or a stab at what they think that the pH might be like in that paddock? Do we think it might be acidic, alkaline, acidic? We're nodding. Yep. Variability, do we think that it'd be pretty consistent across those paddocks, or do you think we might have some areas that are more acid, some areas that are more alkaline? Or
it would vary because the bottom paddock would be heavier, top paddock would be lighter.
Yep. Yep, that's a pretty good assumption. Righto, we'll take a look at the results. So you're right. So the top, as far as the ridge where we've got a bit of a rise, a bit more elevation, we did have more acidic values. There was a more acidic band through the centre here as well. Basically, thank you. To summarise, so we had a minimum of 4.3 pH, which is these purple values are sort of 4.3, 4.4, so that's in calcium chloride, so that's reasonably low values. But then we had a maximum here of 7.3, so, and that's in this central area between the two paddocks. So a range of 3 pH units, and when you consider pH is a log scale, that's a fairly large range, and those measurements from this sort of higher area that's around 6 to 4.7 there is only a couple of 100 metres, so quite interesting, considering on the aerial image you didn't pick up on too much of that variability, I wouldn't have thought. And we do have some definite zones there, so we look at the average pH for those two blocks together, and say we had done a traditional soil test and just gone across the paddock and taken a transect, we might have come out with something around that sort of 5.1, and we might have thought, yeah, right, well that's okay, it could do maybe a little bit of lime, but it's basically in pretty good nick, but we wouldn't have picked up on that variability. And we can see that there is about 120 hectares that is actually below 4.7 pH, so, and then we also have about 130 hectares that it's above 5.2, which is in pretty good shape, as in you're not going to see yield constraints at that sort of pH level. So what we do is we take this through to an application map. So to do that we need to know a few things. We look at our lime source, so you're fortunate here to be quite close to Parks, which is quite a good high quality pit, so about 95% neutralising value, that line. We also consider your target pH, so what you're trying to get to. We generally, as a default, do a 5.2 and a 5.5 map, so you can see the difference in tonnages that are required. And we also consider the soil texture. So we take texture samples throughout our sampling, and that way heavier ground gets more lime to do the same work as lighter ground in general. So we have a calculator that we plug those values into to come up with our lime application rates. So you can see for a target 5.2, the average rate that's required is about 950 kilos a hectare, so a bit under a tonne. And we can see that 166 hectares doesn't need any lime to get it to 5.2, which is good because then we can reallocate that lime into the areas that were more acidic, so through here and up along that ridge, and address those lower acidities and bring those up. So total lime required was 519 odd tonnes, and Peter actually had 520 tonnes in the paddock, so that was great, didn't have to change it at all. But if you had a different amount, then we can tweak that to match what you've got. But I would say a good strategy is to do your mapping a season ahead so you can get organised and cart your lime in the off season and you know how much you need. So I've just got the 5.5 mapped as well. Obviously, sort of heavier textures, you need a fair bit of lime to bring that extra little bit of away. So it's actually increased our average rate to 1.8 tonnes per hectare, so almost double, and requiring about 1,000 tonnes. Liming to 5.5, you might do that if you had an acidic subsoil, or if you're on a lighter texture and it was going to revert quicker. But getting to 5.2 will address issues, and you should at that point not have yield constraints. So it's more of a conversation that you'd have with your agronomist and work out where you wanted to get to. And I've just put this slide in to demonstrate that no matter what colour your tractor is, or your screen, or your spreader, we work with everyone, and basically when we export the prescription map, we do that in the format that's required for you, and we make sure it works. So we don't just send you the file and say good luck. We make sure that you can get it loaded and get it working, or your contractor can. If you did want to do just a manual application, I can also usually get a background map loaded in most GPS displays, so you can just apply in some broad zones. So for instance, in that other paddock you might have 3 zones, maybe a nil in the middle, 2 tonne up the 2 or 3 tonne on that northern western strip, and then maybe 1.5 elsewhere. So obviously if we do have a variable rate equipped spreader, we get a more precise application, but it's not necessarily necessary. Just to summarise, so most of our work over the 2016-17 summer basically stretched from the border down here up to about Lake Cow, was about the most northern farm that we did. So we mapped about 12,500 hectares, and the average pH over all those samples was 4.9. At a target pH of 5.2, our average rate required was 1.3 tonnes per hectare. Doesn't look like those tables have loaded properly, but basically what they're representing is that dark blue is area that didn't require any lime at all, so almost 25%, and the light blue was about 10%, and it required over 2.5 tonnes per hectare. So that's they're areas that if we had just applied a blanket rate and we maybe went with a tonne or a tonne and a half, they would have not been limed enough to get them to where they needed to be, whereas the dark blue section of the graph didn't require any lime at all. So we had the opportunity then to reallocate that to the areas that needed more lime. And then the target 5.5, the average rate was around 2 tonne per hectare, and you can see the area that didn't need lime is decreased, and the area that needed higher rates has increased. Righto, so moving on to phosphorus. So a lot of the time, maybe half or 60% of people who do pH mapping will also get phosphorus mapped, because we're sending the soils to the sample to the lab anyway. It's fairly cost effective to do so. You can see in this paddock we've got a couple of old management zones that have been merged. So this paddock was separate to this one and these 2 smaller ones previously. And you can see that we've got quite a range of Cobble P values there. So the blue and the darker blue are above 50 milligrams per kilogram. And then our sort of into the purple is quite low. So some of these are 12 and 16 milligrams per kilogram. So for that PVI around 100, we'd be looking to get our Cobble P to about 40 milligrams per kilogram as a critical value, I guess. So we can see that down in this area where we've got rates that are 80, 90, there's excessive P there. So is that an opportunity for us to maybe mine that down? maybe we only need to put down a small starter rate, and then we can mine that down and reduce our fertiliser input, save money in that regard. So it's basically money in the ground when you see values like that. It's not bad, it's just that yeah, you've got an excessive amount, whereas in the top paddock you've got some areas that probably need a bit extra to top them up. So and similarly, our average here was 45. So if we had done a traditional soil test, we wouldn't have picked up that there was such a variance across that paddock. So because phosphorus is highly immobile, our past management practices and yield histories really dictate our P levels. So once we can establish our initial P levels, which might be through some grid mapping, we might be able to move to a yield replacement strategy method. But to do that, we need good quality and well-calibrated yield data. So that's definitely a possibility, but as a base step, getting the P map is, you know, if you can determine what your variability is, then you might look down that path. You can see the paddock on the right in this example. Up here, we have 300 and 200 coal P, so really high. And that actually used to be a pig paddock, and that's where the sheds were. So, and you can see as we move away from that, the values drop off. So can we take advantage of that and mine that down? So there's a number of methods to variably apply P. At seeding, if we're equipped, is good. But if not, there are other strategies. So some of my clients have broadcast in deficient areas, which is a bit of a longer term approach, so it may not be available for that crop, but you're putting it down. So for instance, in some of these lower areas, spreading maybe 100 kilos of MAP just to bring that up, maybe 10 coalable P units, whereas you might not be able to achieve that on an air seeder at some of the rates that you might want to put out to bring up deficient areas. And then the other method that I've used with variable rate P is with manure, which is reasonably straightforward as well. So yeah, with phosphorus, the story is there's potential for high input savings without yield compromise. So as long as we know that the crop's getting the initial starter P that it needs, if we then have excessive values, then we can really drop back those rates in those areas. Righto, so just coming back to our initial diagram, covered off on grid soil mapping and talked a little bit about yield replacement strategies. The next thing I'm going to talk about is soil management zones and using strategic soil testing to create variable rate applications off of those. We're going to talk about gypsum, seeding rates and nitrogen. Righto, so management zoning is the concept of splitting a larger management area into subzones which share similar characteristics, and they generally yield similarly. So in the example on the left, we've got a few paddocks that have mostly a red loam texture. Down the bottom there, we've got a red loam weak zone, so we zoned that out because it's always a bit of it doesn't perform as well, so we've put that as a separate zone. Up the top, we've got a bit of a heavier and a bit of a depression where that clay loam is, so we've zoned it out on its own. And then we've got a bit of a gravel rise going through the middle. So we've got sort of the 4 different management strategies for those different areas. So usually our soil properties are the base for our management zones, but then we can make further divisions if they're required, so things like yield might come into that. And often you'll see where you've pulled out fences where paddocks have been amalgamated, that may need to be a separate zone for as many years as it takes for those paddocks to even up. Our management zones form a base layer that enables variable rate management of a number of inputs. So, and they form as a platform for ongoing strategic soil sampling. So if you get your paddocks into their zones, then at the very least, next time you go to do a soil sample, you're not going to do one right across. You're going to do one for that zone, one for that zone, one for that zone, and at least keep our soil samples matched with areas that are like to each other, and hopefully mitigate the effect of that averaging that can happen when we take a bulk soil sample. So the main and the best base layer for doing soil management zoning is an EC map, so electrical conductivity. Hopefully you might have all heard of that. So basically we're looking at mapping bulk conductivity within the soil profile. So that is your water, clay percentage, salts, and some rocks. So magnetite, pyrrhotite, other rocks that are magnetic can affect it. So it's very important to ground truth it. But basically speaking, your EM38, which is the technique that we use, can be used as a proxy for soil texture due to the correlation between texture and moisture. So where you've got clay soils, you're going to get higher readings because there's more moisture in those clay soils. So that's in a nutshell. One thing to remember is that EM38 sensors are looking at the subsoil, so they're most sensitive at about 30 to 50 centimetres and 75 centimetres to a metre. So we've got to take that into mind, and when we do our ground truthing soil sampling, preferably we look deeper as well. But EM38 is a great one-off investment in understanding your soil texture variability. So these are factors that aren't going to change too much year to year relative to each other. So basically once you do that survey, you've got that, and you don't have to go out and do that every couple of years. That's something to work off in the future. So other layers that we might use to combine with our EM mapping, possibly some NDVI imagery, which is becoming more readily available and more affordable. Obviously, I'll make the point that it's select imagery. We want to know what was driving the conditions at that time when it was captured, to be able to interpret it. And the same with yield maps. So that's an example from last harvest. You can see there was a waterway running through there. And these are topographical highs, so we've got better yields in those areas, which makes sense. So we want to know context of the season if we're going to use that yield map for some sort of management zoning. Other layers that are useful is elevation, obviously, but also just some aerial imagery. So a lot of the time, pull up your farm on Google Earth and flick through the images that are captured. There's usually quite a few going back in time. And if you have an image captured at the right time of the year, you might be able to draw some management zones straight from the photograph. So it doesn't have to be high tech, you just have to understand what's going on. And has anyone done one of these? Does that look familiar to anyone? So that's basically management zoning in about 1990, I reckon. So getting an aerial image, overlaying some clear plastic sheets and drawing out the zones in your paddock. A few nods, yep. So what that is, basically, that's growers' knowledge. So we didn't have a lot of the technology that we have now at that point, but you guys, because you run over your paddocks all the time, know a lot. So that's very important to get that involved in the management, making your management zones in that process. I could come in and have a crack, but definitely the farmer themselves has a lot of input that is, very, very useful for management zoning. So to move it through to an application, so the big one with management zones for us is just variable rate gypsum. It's really easy. It's ideal. It fits it very well. So we use grower knowledge or just strategic sampling. So we get our exchangeable sodium percentages to determine our gypsum rates. So you can see in this example, the EM surveys, we've got high zone through here and through here, usually indicating that we have a heavier soil texture. And so on our variable rate gypsum map, we've decided, yep, we're going to put 3 tonne here and here. We'll put 2.5 tonne in this maybe more transitional zone, and then we're only going to put 1,500 kilos up here. And we've got our elevation map here to go, okay, yeah, that's a bit of a rise up there. Maybe it doesn't need so much. And then if we do have a good elevation map at the same time, we might consider doing some strategic surface water management. So putting in some drains or changing our AB lines or to get the water moving in the way that we want it to. So elevation mapping is actually included in our EM38 mapping package, as is creating the management zones and a strategic soil sampling plan. So yeah, if we do an EM38 survey for you, you walk away with management zones, strategic soil plan and an elevation map. Yeah. Seeding rate might be relevant or might not be at all for you, but if you have areas where establishment success differs across zones, then it can be a good tool to bump up seed numbers and make sure you get that establishment. So for instance, in this example, I've got a vertisol and a dermisol, so a heavier soil texture in here. That had 3 tonnes of gypsum on it the end of last year, and this is the end of the eye image from the 7th of June, so quite recently, and it's canola, and you can still see that the emergent success has been a lot poorer on that heavier soil. So maybe next year we consider bumping up our seeding rates just for those zones, for the vertisol zone. Where water holding capacity differs across zones, we might look at varying our seeding rate as well. So in a sandier soil that we think might not hold on as much, maybe we have less plant numbers. And also canopy management for weed populations is another potential application of doing a variable rate seeding rate. The last one is nitrogen, and obviously it starts to get a bit more complex when you're looking at nitrogen. But as a general comment, zonal management of N may be beneficial where you've got significant variation in soil characteristics such as percentage organic matter, CEC or your textures, or water holding capacities. So variations in factors that may affect the way our nitrogen cycle works. So our processes such as mineralisation, which is relying on our organic matter, leaching, things like that. So on a sandier soil, we might expect more leaching to occur. We've got things like that happening. Maybe it's a good idea to look at doing a bit of variable rate. And so some of the strategies that we might use, we might do some deep end sampling based on our soil management zones pre-season or at the start of the season. We might vary our starter rates of N. Definitely a good idea if you can to put in some N-rich strips, and we want to orientate these across our soil zones. So we want to put them through areas that perform poorly and well, so we get a good cross-section to compare down the track. And then we can use NWI imagery and ground truthing, or if you've got maybe a drone or something that you can get up and get some photos, to monitor the variations in N responsiveness along the strips and within each zone. And another point with nitrogen is obviously toward the end of the season when we're planning our later season applications, is to consider if our different soil zones might have different soil moisture, and if it does look like it might be a tighter finish, then we might want to back off in some of those lighter textures that we might not think would have the moisture to kick on, or we might want to push on areas that we do think will have the moisture. So just a little bit about nitrogen there. Yeah, so that's just returning to this slide to summarise. So main sort of potential VR products and some of the ways that we can get to actually making an application, taking that through to an action. Some of take-home messages in my experience. So there's numerous variable rate strategies that are possible, and there's varying levels of investment and involvement. So there's everything from you call me up and say, I want, 300 hectares grid pH mapped. We come and do it, and we send you the application, or we send it to your contractor, and they put it in the spreader and do it, and you don't really have any, you don't need to do anything. Through to some of the management zoning and other strategies that, will definitely would want your involvement. And it depends if your particular situation, warrants that, or what you see fitting with your particular farm. So focus on the strategies that would give you the greatest upfront benefit, and soil amelioration is often a really good place to start. So particularly lime and also gypsum, if that's something that your property needs. So consider opportunities for both yield unlock and maximising input efficiencies. Base your decisions on sound scientific principles. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel or do anything too fancy, we're just using our proven agronomic knowledge, but applying that on a spatial context. And using the technology that we now have available to make smarter applications. And just keep it simple, so stick with what makes sense to you, would be my final point. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you very much.